In 1898, the United States Navy had a problem it could not solve with firepower. The battleship USS Oregon was stationed in San Francisco when war with Spain became unavoidable. The fleet needed every warship it could muster, and the Oregon was ordered to join the Atlantic Squadron off the coast of Florida. There was no shortcut, no canal crossed Central America, no passage through the continent existed. The Oregon had one option: south. All the way south. The ship left San Francisco and steamed down the Pacific coast, through the Strait of Magellan at the southern tip of South America, and then north again through the full length of the Atlantic. The journey covered 14,700 nautical miles. It took between 66 and 71 days. By the time the Oregon arrived in Florida, the war was nearly decided. The ship made it. But the voyage exposed something the Navy already suspected: that the distance between America's two coastlines, measured by sea, was a strategic disaster. At the time, the trip took roughly 40 days longer and covered 8,000 more miles than it would have if a canal had existed across the isthmus. That realization helped push the construction of the Panama Canal. And for more than a century, the canal solved the problem. Ships moved between oceans in hours instead of months. Global trade depended on it. Military logistics depended on it. The entire architecture of modern shipping was built around a small number of narrow passages: the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca, the Bab-el-Mandeb. These are the bottlenecks that keep the world connected, and right now, several of them are failing at the same time. The Panama Canal does not run on seawater. It runs on rain. Every ship that crosses from one ocean to the other must be lifted and lowered through a series of locks, and those locks are filled with fresh water drawn from Gatun Lake, an artificial reservoir fed by rainfall in the surrounding watershed. Each full transit consumes between 50 and 52 million gallons. That water is not recycled. It flows through the locks and drains into the sea. Every ship that passes through the canal is, in effect, emptying part of a lake. In a normal rainy season, Gatun Lake sits at roughly 88 feet above sea level. That depth is enough to keep the locks functioning and to allow ships with deep drafts to pass safely. But the canal exists in a tropical climate that depends on predictable wet seasons, and when those seasons fall short, the lake drops. In fiscal year 2024, Gatun Lake fell to approximately 80 feet. 8 feet may not sound like much, but in a system designed around narrow tolerances, 8 feet changes everything. The Panama Canal Authority responded the only way it could: by restricting traffic. Fewer ships were allowed through each day. Draft limits were tightened, meaning heavier vessels either had to offload cargo before entering or skip the canal entirely. The result was immediate. Total annual transits dropped from 12,638 in the previous fiscal year to 9,936, a decline of 29%. For a waterway that handles a measurable share of global trade, that reduction rippled outward fast. Ships that could not get through the canal, or could not afford to wait, had to find another way. Some sailed south around Cape Horn. Others adjusted their routes entirely, depending on origin and destination. The choices were limited, and none of them were cheap. At the same time, the canal was shrinking. Another choke point was collapsing, not because of weather, but because of war. The Bab-el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow passage at the southern entrance to the Red Sea, connects the Indian Ocean to the Suez Canal. Nearly every vessel moving goods between Asia and Europe passes through it. Beginning in late 2023, Houthi militants based in Yemen began launching attacks on commercial and naval vessels transiting the strait. By early 2025, at least 110 ships had been targeted. The attacks were not random. They followed a pattern of escalation: drones, missiles, and fast boat approaches aimed at container ships, bulk carriers, and tankers. Insurance premiums for Red Sea transits spiked. Some underwriters refused to cover the route at all. Shipping companies faced a hard calculation: risk a billion-dollar vessel and its crew in a live conflict zone, or take the long way around. Most chose the long way. Approximately 90% of container vessels that had previously used the Suez Canal were rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. The numbers attached to that decision are blunt: A vessel traveling from Shanghai to New York through the Suez Canal covers roughly 12,370 nautical miles. The same trip routed around the Cape of Good Hope stretches to approximately 14,468 nautical miles. That difference, about 2,100 miles on that specific route, varies depending on origin and destination. But for vessels diverting from the Red Sea entirely, the Detour can add approximately 7,000 nautical miles and 12 to 14 extra days to a one-way trip. Those added miles do not just cost time. Shipping demand is measured in a unit called the ton-mile, volume multiplied by distance. When thousands of vessels are each sailing thousands of extra miles, the total ton-mile demand on the global fleet increases even if the actual amount of cargo stays the same. Ships that would normally be available for new loads are still at sea, burning fuel on longer legs. The fleet does not grow to meet the new demand. It simply stretches thinner. The cost per vessel is measurable. Rerouting a single ship around the Cape of Good Hope adds an estimated $1 million in additional costs per round trip. Fuel consumption on the longer route increases by roughly 30%. Multiply that across thousands of diversions per year, and the numbers become enormous, not in theory, but in practice. Every rerouted ship is a ship that arrives later, burns more, and ties up port capacity on a shifted schedule. And when the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal are both degraded at the same time, the alternatives narrow sharply. Ships moving between the Atlantic and Pacific without access to Panama face one main option: the southern route around South America. That means the Drake Passage. The Drake Passage sits between the southern tip of South America and the northern edge of Antarctica. It is one of the most dangerous stretches of open water on Earth. The Southern Ocean funnels through this gap with almost nothing to slow it down. Historical records estimate that roughly 800 ships have been lost in the region. Sustained winds regularly reach 55 miles per hour. Waves can build to 30 feet or higher. The conditions are not seasonal anomalies. They are the baseline. In late 2022, 3 separate expedition cruise ships reported fatalities or major injuries in the Drake Passage within a short span of time. One of them, the Viking Polaris, was struck by a rogue wave that killed a passenger and injured several others. These were modern, well-equipped vessels with experienced crews operating in conditions they had planned for. For commercial cargo ships, longer, heavier, and less maneuverable, the risks multiply. Routing a loaded container ship or tanker through the Drake Passage is not just dangerous, it is expensive, slow, and hard to ensure. But when the canal is restricted, it becomes one of the few paths left. There is another layer to this problem that applies specifically to American vessels, and it has nothing to do with weather or conflict. The Merchant Marine Act of 1920, commonly known as the Jones Act, requires that any cargo moved between U.S. ports must be carried on ships that are U.S. built, U.S. owned, and U.S. crewed. The law has been in place for more than a century. Its effect on routing decisions is direct. Building a ship in an American shipyard costs 3 to 4 times more than building the same vessel overseas. That cost gap means the U.S. flagged fleet is small, and the ships in it are expensive to operate. When canal access is restricted and a U.S. vessel needs to move cargo from one American port to another, it cannot simply switch to a foreign flag ship. It must use a Jones Act compliant vessel, and that vessel must now sail the long way around if the canal is closed or restricted. The constraint is especially visible in the energy sector. The United States currently has no Jones Act compliant liquefied natural gas carriers. None. That means domestic natural gas cannot be shipped by sea from the Gulf Coast to the East Coast or to California on American vessels. The gas is instead exported to foreign markets, loaded onto foreign-flagged LNG carriers, and sold abroad, while California and New England import gas from foreign sources. The infrastructure exists, the fuel exists, but the legal framework prevents the domestic connection. Some have looked north for relief. The Northwest Passage, the sea route through the Canadian Arctic, has received growing attention as Arctic ice recedes. In theory, it offers a shorter path between the Atlantic and Pacific for certain routes. In practice, it remains almost unusable for commercial shipping. Ice conditions in the Canadian Arctic are highly variable from year to year. Even in September, when ice coverage reaches its annual minimum, the route is unpredictable. In 2023, 42 ships transited the Northwest Passage. In 2024, that number dropped to just 18. The decline was not caused by reduced interest. It was caused by ice. Beyond the ice itself, the route lacks the most basic infrastructure that commercial shipping requires. There are no refueling stations along the passage. There are no repair facilities. Search and rescue coverage is thin at best. A mechanical failure in the Northwest Passage is not an inconvenience. It is a survival situation. For a loaded cargo vessel, the risk profile is not acceptable under current conditions, regardless of what the ice charts say in any given September. What remains, then, is a system of constrained choices, and those choices play out differently depending on the type of ship and the cargo it carries. In fiscal year 2024, LNG carrier transits through the Panama Canal dropped by 66%, averaging only 4 transits per month. Gas carriers, with their deep drafts and limited scheduling flexibility, were among the hardest hit by the canal's restrictions. Container ships, by contrast, managed a 2% increase in transits over the same period. The reason was not luck. The Panama Canal operates a reservation and auction system that allows shippers to bid for guaranteed transit slots. High-value container cargo justifies the premium. Shippers carrying time-sensitive goods can pay millions of dollars for a reserved slot. Those carrying lower-value bulk cargo often cannot. The system does not discriminate by flag or origin. It discriminates by margin. For vessels that lose the auction or choose not to bid, the alternative is the full detour, roughly 15,000 miles around the southern tip of South America. That is not a rounding error. It is a second voyage layered on top of the first. The fuel, the crew hours, the wear on the vessel, the lost scheduling, all of it compounds. The world's shipping network was designed around a small number of shortcuts. The Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca. These routes were built or chosen because they saved thousands of miles and weeks of transit time. They turned global trade from a slow, dangerous proposition into something fast enough to justify itself economically. But that design carries a built-in weakness. When even one of those shortcuts fails, the system absorbs the blow. When 2 or more fail at the same time, one from drought, one from conflict, the system does not adapt gracefully. It stretches. Routes get longer. Costs go up. Capacity tightens. And ships that were supposed to be somewhere 3 weeks ago are still at sea, burning fuel on a route that no one planned for. The USS Oregon made its 14,700-mile journey in 1898 because there was no canal. More than 125 years later, the canal exists. But for a growing number of vessels, in a growing number of months, it might as well not.